When people imagine economic disasters, they picture explosions. Markets collapsing overnight, banks shuttering, panic on the streets. But real financial catastrophes, the ones that reshape entire generations, they don't arrive with noise. They arrive with silence. They whisper. And most people don't hear the whisper until it turns into a scream. Right now, that whisper has never been louder. For more than 700 days, nearly 2 full years, the United States lived through something almost unprecedented in modern history, the longest yield curve inversion in close to a century. A signal so rare, so extreme, and so persistent that in any other period of history, it would have been treated as a 5-alarm fire. Instead, most people barely noticed. And yet this single indicator, this obscure-sounding yield curve inversion, has predicted almost every major recession since World War II with astonishing accuracy. Not sometimes. Not often. Almost every single time. But here's the part that people never quite grasp. It's not just the inversion itself that matters. It's how long it lasts. Because the deeper and longer that signal stays inverted, the worse the recession that inevitably follows. This isn't a theory. It isn't speculation. It's one of the most consistent patterns in all of economic history. And our recent inversion? It wasn't just long. It lasted longer than the warning signs before 2008. Longer than the warning signs before the dot-com collapse. Longer than the signals before Black Monday. Longer even than the inversion that preceded the Great Depression. We just lived through the most prolonged warning the bond market has issued in almost 100 years, and somehow, society shrugged. But once you understand what the yield curve actually represents, the picture becomes far more disturbing. The yield curve is the bond market's vote on the future, a kind of financial seismograph reading the pressure building deep beneath the surface. And when short-term borrowing becomes more expensive than long-term borrowing, it signals something simple and terrifying. Investors believe the near future is more dangerous than the distant one. That only happens when they expect economic damage. Not maybe. Not possibly. But likely. And the last time the signal stayed inverted anywhere near as long as it just did, the United States plunged into the most devastating economic collapse it has ever known. We're now past the inversion. The curve has normalized. But that's not a relief, that's the real danger zone. Because history shows the crash doesn't come during the inversion. It comes after it ends. And today we are standing exactly in that window. The whisper has already happened. What comes next depends on whether we choose to listen, or ignore the loudest quiet warning the financial system has given us in living memory. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, we need to look backward, because the economy has a habit of repeating its darkest chapters when people grow too confident to imagine them happening again. The yield curve has been our most reliable early warning instrument for decades. And every time society dismissed it, the consequences were brutal. Let's start with the most infamous example. In 1928, the yield curve flipped into inversion. For months it stayed there quietly flashing red. And the stock market? It didn't just ignore the warning, it surged. Investors believed they were living in a new era of unstoppable prosperity. Industrial growth was booming, unemployment was low, and new technologies like radio and automobiles were transforming daily life. It felt like nothing could go wrong. Sound familiar? By the time the market finally peaked in 1929, nearly all the classic signs were already in place. But society wasn't paying attention. And when the crash finally came, it didn't come gently, it came like a dam breaking. Over the next 3 years, stocks lost almost 90% of their value. The economy didn't recover for a decade. The psychological scars lasted even longer. Now fast forward. The same pattern repeated in the mid-2000s. The yield curve inverted in late 2005, a full 2 years before the financial system began to crumble. And again, just like 1929, the warning was ignored. Housing prices kept rising. Banks kept lending. Investors kept celebrating. Everyone said the old rules didn't apply anymore, that financial engineering had eliminated risk. But risk can't be eliminated. It can only be buried. And when it resurfaces, it does so violently. By 2007, the cracks were visible. By 2008, the system collapsed. Millions lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings in one of the most devastating recessions in modern times. Here's the part almost nobody realizes. Both of those inversions, 1929 and 2008, were significantly shorter than the one we just went through. The Great Depression warning lasted about 18 months. The 2008 inversion lasted around 10 months. Ours lasted more than 700 days, nearly double the Great Depression signal and 7 times longer than the 2008 one. History isn't whispering to us anymore. It's shouting. Because every previous cycle follows the same script. 1. The yield curve inverts. 2. The public ignores it. 3. Markets keep rising. 4. The inversion ends. 5. A recession hits months later. 6. The deeper and longer the inversion, the more violent the crash. And now, we are standing right between steps 4 and 5. The inversion has ended. The countdown has begun. But unlike 1929 and 2008, we aren't just facing a bubble in one part of the economy. We're facing imbalances across almost every sector simultaneously, structural faults that have been widening beneath our feet for years. And that brings us to the part that should concern everyone paying attention. If past inversions were warning shots, the one we just lived through was an air raid siren stretched across 2 years. Because this time, the conditions are radically different. This time, the pressure didn't build in a normal economy. It built inside an economy that had been artificially distorted for more than a decade. And distortions always have consequences. For nearly 15 years, interest rates hovered near zero. Money became so cheap that it lost meaning. Corporations borrowed recklessly. Consumers financed lifestyles they couldn't sustain. The government expanded spending to levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. It wasn't organic growth. It was growth on life support. Growth inflated by trillions of dollars that didn't come from productivity, innovation, or efficiency, but from the Federal Reserve's attempt to manipulate stability. And then, when inflation exploded, the Fed did the only thing it could. It hit the brakes hard. Rates were hiked faster than at any time in modern history. Liquidity dried up. Borrowing costs surged. And the yield curve flipped, and stayed inverted longer than almost any point in the last 100 years. That alone would be alarming. But what came next is what turns this from worrying to truly dangerous. This inversion didn't end because the economy healed. It ended because the Federal Reserve was forced to start cutting rates again, not from a position of strength but from fear of what happens if they didn't. In other words, the yield curve didn't normalize because things improved. It normalized because things got unstable. And now all the artificial supports that once held the economy together are unwinding, simultaneously. Look beneath the surface and the cracks are everywhere. Consumer debt is at record highs. Credit card balances have crossed $1.2 trillion. Delinquencies have doubled since 2022. People aren't spending because they feel confident, they're spending because they're borrowing to survive. Corporate debt paints an even darker picture. Companies gorge themselves on cheap money. Now the bill is due. Refinancing costs have exploded, and many businesses simply can't afford it. Bankruptcies are climbing. Balance sheets are cracking. Regional banks, already weakened, are sitting on vast portfolios of long-term bonds that have plunged in value as rates rose. On paper they look solvent. In reality, many are one shock away from collapse. And commercial real estate? It's a powder keg. Office buildings sit half empty. Retail spaces are disappearing. Apartment complexes are struggling as rents flatten and costs rise. The loans behind these properties are concentrated, again, in regional banks. It's a slow-moving chain reaction, but when it hits the ignition point, it spreads fast. Then layer on government debt, now at levels that historically trigger loss of control. Add in geopolitical stress, from supply chain fractures to escalating conflicts. Add inflation still far from defeated. Add an entire generation of investors trained to believe the Federal Reserve can fix anything. And what you get is a system more fragile than at any time since the 1930s. The surface looks strong. Markets hitting records. Unemployment still low. Corporate earnings beating expectations. But that's the same illusion we saw in 1929. And the same illusion we saw in 2007. A system can look stable, right up until it collapses. And that collapse becomes far more likely when you combine historically long warning signals with historically large structural imbalances. This time is not different. This time is the logical endpoint of 15 years of distortion, debt, and denial. And now the pressure is shifting from build-up to release. If you know how to read the signs, the economy is already revealing the truth. It's like watching hairline fractures spread across a sheet of glass, invisible from afar, but up close you can see the entire structure beginning to fail. The signs are everywhere. Let's start with the American consumer, the engine of the U.S. economy. From the outside, spending looks strong. Stores are full. Travel is booming. People are still buying cars, phones, appliances, experiences. But look beneath the surface and the reality is stark. Consumers aren't spending because they're confident. They're spending because they're desperate. They're stretching car loans to 7 and 8 years just to afford a monthly payment. They're taking cash advances on credit cards to cover rent. They're refinancing mortgages not to improve their homes, but to survive another month. These aren't signs of strength. They're signs of people living on borrowed time. And what happens when people exhaust their ability to borrow? The consumer engine stalls. And when it stalls, the entire economy seizes with it. But consumers aren't the only ones cracking. The corporate world looks just as fragile. Take small businesses, the lifeblood of employment in America. Many survived the pandemic only because they were artificially kept alive by emergency loans and government programs. Businesses that should have failed, didn't. They became zombie companies, technically alive but only because they were fed cheap money. Now that support is gone. Their debts are coming due. Customers are cutting back. Suppliers are demanding faster payment. The life support has been unplugged and the failures are beginning to spike. But the real danger? It's sitting inside the banking system. Regional banks are sitting on losses so large they can't acknowledge them publicly. They bought long-term bonds when interest rates were near zero, thinking they were safe. Now, as rates have risen, those bonds have collapsed in value. If these banks had to mark those assets to market today, a horrifying number would be insolvent. It's the same mentality that led to the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s. It's the same mentality that caused hidden balance sheet detonations in 2008. And today the exposure is even larger. And then there's commercial real estate, the silent giant. Office towers across major cities are half empty. Remote work didn't shift the market. It obliterated demand. Shopping centers are thinning out as online retail accelerates. Apartment buildings are being squeezed by rising maintenance costs and softening rents. And most of the loans tied to these properties? Held by the same fragile regional banks. This is a slow-motion avalanche. Once one section gives way, the rest follows. But the biggest bubble of all, the one almost nobody wants to discuss, is government debt. Federal spending is on a trajectory that defies logic. Every crisis triggers more borrowing. Every downturn demands more stimulus. Every political promise is funded with money that doesn't exist. The debt-to-GDP ratio has crossed levels that historically signal a loss of fiscal control. State and local governments aren't doing any better. Underfunded pensions, decaying infrastructure, shrinking tax bases as businesses migrate to cheaper states. When the next recession hits and tax revenues collapse, these governments will face impossible choices. Default, or slash services so deeply that public unrest becomes unavoidable. But this isn't just an American problem. It's global. The dollar's dominance, once unquestioned, is now being challenged. Countries are building alternative systems. Central banks are reducing US dollar reserves and increasing their gold holdings. Oil producers are experimenting with non-dollar transactions. If the dollar loses even part of its reserve status, the inflation the US has been exporting for decades will come surging back home. Then add energy instability, an under-discussed trigger point. Renewables are growing too slowly to replace fossil fuels, but fast enough to discourage investment in new production. This creates structural shortages. All it takes is one geopolitical shock to send energy prices into the stratosphere, crushing consumers and unraveling supply chains. And what about the sector everyone trusts the most, technology? AI promises the future, but most AI investments are hemorrhaging money. Social media platforms are losing engagement and ad revenue. Crypto remains a speculative roller coaster. The tech valuations we see today make the dot-com bubble look humble. Everything is stretched. Everything is fragile. Everything depends on the assumption that nothing will go wrong. But the yield curve, the most reliable predictor we have, has already told us something will go wrong. And not just something mild. Not a soft landing. Not a small correction. Something proportionate to the magnitude of the warning we just received, the longest warning signal in nearly a century. And now we're entering the window when recessions historically begin. The signal has been given. The system is weakening. And the countdown is happening silently. But there's one more piece to the puzzle, maybe the most important of all. And that's what we'll get to next. There's a pattern in every major financial collapse. Not in the numbers, in the psychology. Before every crisis, there's a moment when the data is screaming, the signals are flashing, and the pressure is building. But society convinces itself that everything is fine. People believe what they want to believe. They trust the headlines instead of the warning signs. They trust momentum instead of history. They trust that this time is different. But it never is. In 1929, America believed it had entered a new age of permanent prosperity, right up until the market imploded. In 2008, people believed the housing market could never fall. right up until it did everywhere all at once. And today, investors believe that technology, stimulus, and central banks can overpower the laws of economic gravity. But the yield curve doesn't care what people believe. It reflects reality, not optimism. And for more than 700 days, it delivered the clearest message the financial system can send. A major downturn is coming. Now the inversion is over. And this is the part that should make everyone pay attention. Recessions rarely begin during an inversion. They begin after it ends. That's where we are right now, standing in the middle of the most dangerous stretch of the economic cycle. The part where complacency turns into panic. Where hidden weaknesses snap into the open. Where the correction finally arrives. And the severity of that correction is almost always proportional to the length of the warning. Short inversions bring mild recessions. Long inversions bring deep ones. Historically long inversions like the one we just witnessed, bring something far worse. This isn't doom for the sake of doom. It's not fear-mongering. It's history repeating itself in slow motion. Look around. Consumer behavior is shifting in all the same ways it did before past crashes. Businesses are tightening without announcing it. Banks are sitting on losses they can't acknowledge. Governments are borrowing like the bill will never come due. The global order is fracturing. Asset bubbles stretch across multiple sectors at once. The surface looks calm, but only because the pressure hasn't released yet. And when it does, it will feel sudden. Even though the warning lasted nearly 2 years. The question isn't whether a recession is coming. The question is how severe it will be, and whether anyone is prepared for it. Some are. The wealthy quietly shifting into hard assets. Central banks stocking up on precious metals. Corporations cutting risks behind closed doors. But most people? They're still asleep. The reckoning doesn't wait for public opinion. It arrives when the pressure reaches its limit, and that limit is closer than most realize. If you want to understand what's coming, not the headlines, not the spin, but the real forces reshaping our financial future, make sure you stay informed. This story isn't over. It's just beginning. And if you want to be ready for what's next, subscribe to Finance Archives, where we break down the signals, the history, and the hidden patterns the mainstream never talks about. Because the next chapter of this economic cycle is coming whether we're prepared or not.